On the evening of March 14, 2008, in Palatka, Florida, 3 teenagers walked into a stretch of woods behind the old railroad tracks near Memorial Parkway, and only 2 of them walked back out. What happened in those woods would remain hidden for 11 years, buried under layers of lies, teenage loyalty, and a small town's unwillingness to believe that its own children could be capable of something so brutal. By the time the truth finally surfaced in 2019, the people who knew what happened had built entire lives around keeping it secret. This is the story of how silence can hold a community hostage for over a decade, and what it takes to finally break it. Before I reveal the web of loyalty, fear, and calculated deception that kept this case cold for more than a decade, go ahead and subscribe. These stories exist so the truth doesn't disappear with time, and so that the people left behind know someone's still listening. Now, I want you to think about something. If you knew a terrible secret when you were 16, and saying nothing meant you could keep your life exactly as it was, what would you do? Would you speak up immediately, or would you convince yourself that staying quiet was easier, safer, maybe even kinder? That question sits at the heart of what happened in Palatka in 2008, and why it took so long for anyone to say what they knew. Let me tell you about Palatka first. It's a city of about 10,000 people, tucked along the St. Johns River in northeast Florida, roughly an hour south of Jacksonville. It's the kind of place where people know each other's families going back generations, where Friday night football matters more than most things, and where reputation can follow you your entire life. In 2008, it was still recovering from years of economic decline. The paper mill that once employed half the town had closed. Main Street had more empty storefronts than open ones. For teenagers growing up there, Palatka could feel like a place you were stuck in, not a place you chose. Ryan Hillegas was 15 years old in March of 2008. He lived with his mother and younger sister in a duplex on the north side of town, not far from the Putnam County School District offices. Ryan was quiet, not unpopular, but not part of the core group either. He played some baseball in middle school but dropped it by high school. Teachers described him as polite, though he didn't raise his hand much in class. He had a handful of close friends, kids he'd grown up with, and most weekends he spent riding bikes or walking around town because there wasn't much else to do. He wasn't the kind of kid people worried about. He didn't get into fights. He didn't skip school. He came from a single-parent home, but so did a lot of kids in Palatka. His mother worked 2 jobs, one at a pharmacy and one cleaning offices at night, and Ryan had learned early to take care of himself and his sister. If you passed him on the street, you probably wouldn't remember him. And that's part of what made what happened so hard for people to understand later. On March 14, Ryan left his house around 6 in the evening. His mother was at work. His sister was at a friend's house. He told a neighbor he was going to meet some friends near the old tracks. That wasn't unusual. A lot of kids hung out near the railroad because it was away from adults, away from supervision, a place where you could be loud or stupid or just sit and talk without anyone telling you to go home. The last confirmed sighting of Ryan alive was at a gas station on Reed Street around 6:30 p.m. A clerk remembered him buying a soda and a bag of chips. She said he seemed normal. He didn't look scared. He didn't look like anything was wrong. What no one realized at the time was that Ryan wasn't meeting a group of friends. He was meeting 2 people. And one of them had already decided that Ryan wasn't going to leave those woods. When Ryan didn't come home that night, his mother wasn't immediately alarmed. He'd stayed out late before, sometimes crashing at a friend's house without calling. Cell phones weren't as universal then as they are now, especially for kids in a town like Palatka. But by the next morning, when Ryan still hadn't come home and wasn't at school, she started calling around. None of his usual friends had seen him. No one knew where he was. She filed a missing person report with the Palatka Police Department on March 15, less than 24 hours after he'd disappeared. The officer who took the report was respectful but not overly concerned. Ryan was 15. He was probably fine. Kids ran off sometimes, especially boys that age. They usually came back in a day or 2. But Ryan's mother knew something was wrong. She knew her son. She knew he wouldn't just vanish without a word. She spent that entire day driving around Palatka, checking every place she could think of, asking anyone who might have seen him. By evening, she was standing in the police station demanding they do more. It wasn't until March 17, 3 days after Ryan disappeared, that a jogger running along the trail near the old railroad tracks noticed something unusual about 50 yards into the woods. A backpack, partially hidden under brush. The jogger called the police, and when officers arrived and started searching the area more carefully, they found Ryan. He was lying face down in a shallow depression, covered with leaves and branches. He'd been beaten to death. The medical examiner would later determine that he died from blunt force trauma to the head and chest, consistent with being struck repeatedly with a heavy object. There were defensive wounds on his hands and forearms. He'd tried to protect himself. He'd fought back. But he'd been outnumbered. The news of Ryan's death moved through Palatka like a cold wind. People locked their doors. Parents started driving their kids to school instead of letting them walk. There was a vigil at the high school, even though Ryan had only been a freshman. People left flowers and stuffed animals near the spot where his body was found, though most of them had never spoken to him when he was alive. To detectives, it looked like a crime of opportunity, maybe a robbery gone wrong, or an attack by someone older, someone transient. Palatka had its share of drifters who moved through town along the railroad lines. But to the people who knew Ryan, none of that made sense. He didn't carry money. He didn't own anything worth stealing. And he wasn't the kind of kid who would have gotten into a confrontation with a stranger. What investigators didn't know yet was that Ryan's death wasn't random. It wasn't a robbery. It wasn't a stranger. It was something much harder to accept. The Palatka Police Department assigned Detective Laura Enzer to lead the investigation. She was in her early 40s then, a 15-year veteran of the department, and one of only 3 women in the detective division. She'd worked everything from domestic cases to drug trafficking, but this was her first homicide involving a juvenile victim. She knew the case would define her career one way or another. Enzer started by interviewing Ryan's family, his teachers, his friends. Everyone described him the same way: quiet, kind, not someone who got into trouble. No one could think of anyone who would want to hurt him. There were no obvious suspects. No one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. But Enzer knew that in a town like Palatka, someone always knew something. It was just a matter of finding the person willing to say it. She focused on the last known sighting at the gas station. The clerk confirmed Ryan had been alone when he bought the soda and chips. Enzer pulled security footage from the store and saw Ryan leaving on foot, heading east toward the railroad tracks. She canvassed the area, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen Ryan that evening or noticed anything unusual. Most people said no. But one woman, a nurse who lived 2 blocks from the tracks, mentioned that she'd seen a group of kids near the railroad around dusk on March 14. She couldn't describe them clearly, it was getting dark, but she remembered thinking it was an odd time for kids to be out there. She'd seen 2 boys and maybe a girl, though she wasn't certain. That detail, 2 boys and maybe a girl, would stay with Enzer for years. She compiled a list of Ryan's known associates, kids he'd been seen with in the weeks before his death. She interviewed more than 30 teenagers in the first 2 weeks of the investigation. Most of them were cooperative, but in the way teenagers are when they're talking to police, guarded, careful, not offering anything they didn't have to. One name kept coming up: Justin Soto. He was 16, a sophomore at Palatka High School. He and Ryan had been friends since middle school, though several people mentioned they'd had some kind of falling out recently. No one knew exactly what it was about. Justin was more outgoing than Ryan, more confident, the kind of kid who could talk his way into or out of most situations. He played football, though he wasn't a starter. He had a girlfriend, a junior named Amber Reitzman. When Enzer interviewed Justin on March 20th, he was calm, almost too calm. He said he hadn't seen Ryan in over a week. They'd had an argument, something stupid, he couldn't even remember what it was about. He said he was sorry Ryan was dead, but he didn't know anything about what happened. His mother sat next to him during the interview, and she confirmed that Justin had been home the night of March 14th. Enzer didn't believe him. There was something in the way he answered her questions, too rehearsed, too careful. But she didn't have anything concrete to challenge him with. No physical evidence. No witnesses placing him at the scene. She had to let him go. She interviewed Amber Reitzman separately. Amber was 17, quiet in a different way than Ryan had been. Where Ryan's quietness had seemed like shyness, Amber's felt more like calculation. She was polite, answered every question, but Enzer felt like she was being managed. Amber said she barely knew Ryan. She'd seen him around school, but they didn't talk. She said she'd been with Justin the night of March 14th, at his house, watching movies. Justin's mother confirmed that too. Enzer noted the alibi, but she also noted how quickly it had been offered. The investigation stalled. Forensic evidence from the scene was minimal. The medical examiner confirmed that Ryan had been killed with a blunt object, likely a piece of wood or metal pipe, but the weapon was never found. There were no usable fingerprints. No DNA that led anywhere. The ground where Ryan's body was found was too disturbed to yield clear footprints. It had rained the night after he was killed, washing away anything that might have been there. Enzer kept working the case, but leads dried up. Tips that came in through the anonymous hotline went nowhere. A few people called to report seeing suspicious vehicles near the tracks, but none of it connected to Ryan. Some callers just wanted to share their theories, usually involving drifters or gang activity, though Palatka didn't really have gangs in any organized sense. By the summer of 2008, the case was cold. Not officially, Enzer still had it on her desk, but there was nothing active to pursue. The Palatka Police Department was a small agency. They didn't have the resources to keep a detective working full-time on a case with no leads. Enzer was assigned other investigations. Ryan's case became something she thought about late at night, something she pulled out every few months to review, hoping she'd missed something. Ryan's mother never stopped asking questions. She called the police department every week. She posted flyers around town. She organized vigils on the anniversary of his death. She wanted people to remember. She wanted someone to care as much as she did. But as time passed, the community's attention drifted. People had their own lives, their own problems. Ryan became a sad story people mentioned occasionally, but not something that kept them up at night. What Enzer couldn't have known then was that the truth was being held in place by three people who saw each other almost every day. They passed in the hallways at school. They sat in the same classrooms. They went to the same parties. And none of them said a word. Think about what that takes. Not just keeping a secret for a few days or weeks, but for years. Carrying the weight of it through your entire adolescence, into adulthood, knowing that at any moment, if you slipped, if you got angry, if you felt guilty enough to confess, everything would collapse. That kind of silence isn't passive. It's active. It's a choice you make every single day. Justin Soto graduated from Palatka High School in 2010. He didn't go to college. He got a job at a warehouse in Jacksonville and moved into an apartment with some friends. People who knew him said he seemed fine, normal, maybe a little quieter than he used to be, but not in a way that raised concern. He stayed in touch with Amber, though their relationship had ended not long after graduation. They still texted occasionally. They still had that shared history, even if they didn't talk about it. Amber Reitzman left Palatka after graduation in 2009. She enrolled at Florida State College in Jacksonville, studying nursing. She worked part-time at a drugstore. She made new friends, people who didn't know anything about her life in Palatka, people who didn't know Ryan Hillegas had ever existed. She built a clean, careful life, one where the past didn't intrude unless she let it. And for almost a decade, it worked. The secret held. No one talked. No one broke. But secrets like that don't disappear. They just wait. In 2015, Detective Enzer retired from the Palatka Police Department. She'd worked there for 22 years, and Ryan's case was still the one that bothered her most. She kept a copy of the case file at home, in a box in her closet. She still thought about it. She still wondered who killed Ryan and why no one had ever said anything. The case was reassigned to a younger detective, but without new leads, there wasn't much to do except wait. And that's what they did. They waited. By 2018, Ryan Hillegas had been dead for 10 years. His mother still lived in Palatka. His sister had moved to Georgia. The memorial near the railroad tracks was gone, overgrown, forgotten. If you asked most people in Palatka about Ryan, they might remember the name, but they probably couldn't tell you much else. The case had become part of the town's history, something that happened once, a long time ago. But that year, something shifted. Justin Soto's life started to unravel. He'd lost his job at the warehouse. He'd broken up with a girlfriend, badly, the kind of breakup where police were called for a domestic disturbance. He was drinking more, getting into arguments with friends, pushing people away. He moved back to Palatka, back to his mother's house, and people who saw him said he looked worn down, older than 30, like something was eating at him from the inside. One night in late 2018, Justin went to a bar on the south side of Palatka, a place called The Anchor. He drank too much, got into an argument with another customer, and ended up sitting alone at the bar talking to the bartender, a woman named Shelley who'd known Justin in high school. She asked him what was going on, why he seemed so angry all the time, and Justin, drunk and exhausted, said something that made her stop wiping down the bar and look at him. He said, "You ever do something you can't take back, and it just follows you forever?" Shelley said, "Everyone's done something they regret." And Justin said, "Not like this." He didn't say anything else that night. But Shelley remembered the conversation. She remembered the look on his face, like he was carrying something too heavy to hold anymore. What Justin didn't know was that Amber Reitzman was having her own crisis. She was 27 years old, working as a nurse at a hospital in Jacksonville, and by all appearances, her life was stable. But she'd started seeing a therapist. She wasn't sleeping well. She was having panic attacks. And in one of those sessions, she told her therapist something she'd never told anyone outside the original circle: she'd been there the night Ryan Hillegas died. Her therapist, bound by confidentiality, couldn't report what Amber said unless there was immediate danger to someone. There wasn't. Ryan was already dead. The crime was over. But the therapist encouraged Amber to consider what carrying that secret was doing to her, how it was shaping her life, her relationships, her ability to trust herself. Amber didn't go to the police immediately. But she started to think about it. She started to imagine what it would feel like to finally say it out loud, to someone who could actually do something. In early 2019, a local journalist named Marcus Webb started working on a series about unsolved crimes in Northeast Florida. He'd grown up in Palatka, and Ryan's case was one he remembered clearly. He reached out to the Palatka Police Department and asked if he could review the case file. The department agreed, with limitations. Webb spent weeks going through the file, conducting his own interviews, talking to people who'd been involved in the original investigation. He published the first article in March 2019, on the 11th anniversary of Ryan's death. It was titled, "The Boy in the Woods, 11 Years Without Answers." The article reviewed the facts of the case, interviewed Ryan's mother, and raised questions about why the investigation had stalled. Webb didn't name any suspects, he didn't have enough to do that responsibly, but he did note that several people who were interviewed in 2008 had given alibis that were never fully corroborated. The article was shared widely on social media, especially among people who'd grown up in Palatka. For many, it was the first time they'd thought about Ryan in years. The comment sections filled with people sharing memories, offering theories, expressing frustration that the case was still unsolved. One person who read the article was Amber Reitzman. She read it on her phone during a break at work, and something about seeing Ryan's name in print, seeing his picture, seeing his mother's words, broke something loose inside her. She sat in her car in the hospital parking lot and cried for the first time in years about what had happened. 2 weeks after the article was published, Amber called the Palatka Police Department and asked to speak to someone about the Ryan Hillegas case. The detective who took her call was Michael Torres. He'd been with the department for 6 years and had inherited Ryan's case when Enzer retired. He'd reviewed the file, but like everyone before him, he didn't have anywhere to go with it. When his assistant told him someone was on the line asking about the Hillegas case, he assumed it was another dead-end tip. But when Amber identified herself and said, "I was there the night Ryan died," Torres immediately started recording the call. Amber didn't confess to killing Ryan. That wasn't her role. But what she did was break the silence. She told Torres that she'd been at the railroad tracks on March 14, 2008. She'd been with Justin Soto and another boy, a kid named Tyler Marsh. She said Ryan had been there too, and that there'd been an argument, something about money Ryan supposedly owed Tyler. She said things escalated quickly, and Tyler started hitting Ryan with a piece of rebar he'd found near the tracks. She said Justin had joined in. She said she tried to stop them, but she was scared, and by the time it was over, Ryan was dead. She said they'd covered his body with branches and left. She said they'd agreed never to talk about it. She said Justin's mother had helped them create the alibi, saying they'd been at her house when they hadn't been. Torres asked her why she was coming forward now, after 11 years. Amber said, "Because I can't do this anymore. I can't keep pretending it didn't happen." Torres asked if she was willing to make a formal statement. She said yes. He asked if she was willing to testify if charges were filed. She said yes. Torres immediately contacted the state attorney's office and requested a meeting. The case was suddenly very much alive. The challenge facing prosecutors was that Amber's testimony, by itself, wasn't enough to secure a conviction. She was an accomplice, or at minimum a witness who'd waited 11 years to report a crime. A defense attorney could argue she was lying, or misremembering, or trying to deflect blame. They needed corroboration. They needed physical evidence or additional witnesses. Ideally, they needed a confession from one of the others. Torres and 2 other detectives began reinvestigating the case with Amber's statement as a foundation. They tracked down Tyler Marsh, who was now 27 and living in Gainesville. They brought him in for questioning. Tyler denied everything. He said he didn't know what Amber was talking about. He said he hadn't seen Ryan in years before his death. He refused to answer further questions without a lawyer. Justin Soto was next. Torres and his team arrested him on April 9, 2019, 11 years and 3 weeks after Ryan's death. The charge was second-degree murder. Torres informed Justin that they had a witness who'd placed him at the scene, and that they had evidence corroborating that testimony. Justin's first response was silence. He sat in the interrogation room for nearly 20 minutes without saying a word. Then he asked, "Who talked?" Torres didn't answer. He just repeated that they had testimony and evidence, and that Justin's best option was to tell his side of the story. And after another long silence, Justin started talking. "Right now, as this story unfolds, what time is it where you're listening from?" Justin's confession took almost 3 hours. He didn't try to deny that he'd been there. He didn't try to claim it was an accident. He described what happened that night in detail, and his version largely matched what Amber had already told police. He said Tyler Marsh had been angry at Ryan over money, $20 that Ryan had borrowed weeks earlier and never paid back. Justin said he'd been friends with both of them and had tried to stay neutral, but Tyler kept pushing, kept saying Ryan was disrespecting him, kept saying they needed to teach him a lesson. Justin said he didn't take it seriously at first. He thought Tyler was just talking. But on the evening of March 14, Tyler called Justin and told him to meet at the tracks. He said he'd gotten Ryan to come out there, told him they were going to hang out. Justin said he brought Amber because he thought having her there might keep things from getting out of hand. When they arrived, Ryan was already there, waiting. Tyler confronted him about the money. Ryan said he didn't have it, he'd pay him back when he could. Tyler said that wasn't good enough. The argument got louder. Ryan tried to leave, and Tyler grabbed him. Ryan pushed back. Tyler picked up a piece of rebar that was lying near the tracks, left over from some old construction project, and hit Ryan across the back. Ryan went down. He tried to get up, and Tyler hit him again. Justin said he just stood there at first, frozen, not sure what to do. He said Amber was screaming at Tyler to stop. But Tyler didn't stop. He kept hitting Ryan, and then, Justin said, he joined in. He said he didn't know why. He said it was like something took over, like he couldn't stop himself once he started. By the time they stopped, Ryan wasn't moving. Justin said they checked for a pulse and couldn't find one. Tyler said they needed to hide the body. They dragged Ryan deeper into the woods, covered him with branches, and left. Justin said they agreed on the way back to town that they would never talk about it. Tyler said if anyone asked, they hadn't been there, they didn't know anything. Justin said his mother noticed he seemed upset when he got home, and he told her what happened. He said she was angry and scared, but she agreed to say he'd been home all night if anyone asked. And that's what they did. For 11 years. Torres asked Justin why he was confessing now. Justin said, because Amber's already told you, and I'm tired of lying. With Justin's confession, prosecutors had what they needed. Tyler Marsh was arrested on April 12, 2019, and charged with first-degree murder. Justin Soto's charge was upgraded to first-degree murder as well, given his participation in the attack. Amber Reitzman was charged with accessory after the fact and obstruction of justice, though prosecutors indicated they'd recommend leniency in exchange for her cooperation. Justin's mother, Rebecca Soto, was charged with obstruction of justice for providing a false alibi. She initially denied the charge, but phone records and witness statements corroborated that she'd known what happened and had helped cover it up. The arrests made headlines throughout Florida. The case that had been forgotten for over a decade was suddenly front-page news. People in Palatka were stunned. Many had known Justin and Tyler. Some had gone to school with them. The idea that two local kids, not strangers, not outsiders, had killed Ryan and then lived among them for years without anyone knowing was almost too much to process. Ryan's mother, who'd spent 11 years demanding answers, finally had them. But the relief was complicated. She said in an interview that she was grateful the people responsible were finally being held accountable, but that nothing would bring Ryan back. She said she wished someone had come forward sooner, that 11 years was too long to wait for the truth. Tyler Marsh went to trial in early 2020. His defense attorney argued that Justin's confession was unreliable, that he'd only confessed because he knew Amber had already implicated him, and that there was reasonable doubt about who had actually delivered the fatal blows. But Amber's testimony was detailed and consistent. Justin's confession corroborated it. Forensic evidence, though limited, didn't contradict the narrative. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning a guilty verdict on charges of first-degree murder. Tyler was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. The judge, in delivering the sentence, noted that Tyler had shown no remorse, had never apologized to Ryan's family, and had fought accountability at every step. Justin Soto accepted a plea deal. In exchange for his full cooperation and his testimony against Tyler, he pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison. At his sentencing hearing, Justin read a statement apologizing to Ryan's family. He said he thought about Ryan every day, that he was sorry for what he'd done and for the years of silence. Ryan's mother sat in the courtroom and listened, but she didn't respond. Later, she said she didn't forgive him, but she was glad he'd finally told the truth. Amber Reitzman's case was resolved separately. She pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice and received a sentence of 5 years probation. The prosecutor acknowledged that her decision to come forward had been critical to solving the case, and that without her, Tyler and Justin might never have been held accountable. Rebecca Soto pleaded no contest to obstruction charges and received 2 years of probation. She lost her job. She left Palatka shortly after and hasn't spoken publicly about the case. The resolution of Ryan's case brought something to Palatka that had been missing for over a decade: an answer. Not justice in the fullest sense, nothing could give Ryan his life back, but accountability. The people responsible were finally named. The truth was finally public. And for Ryan's mother, there was a kind of relief in knowing she hadn't been wrong, that her instinct that someone in town knew something had been correct all along. But the case also left Palatka with uncomfortable questions. How had 3 teenagers kept such a devastating secret for so long? How had no one noticed? How had Justin and Tyler walked through town, gone to school, held jobs, lived what looked like normal lives, while carrying the knowledge of what they'd done? The answer, as much as there is one, comes down to loyalty, fear, and the way small communities can create environments where silence feels safer than truth. Justin and Tyler knew that if they stayed quiet, if they didn't crack, there was a good chance they'd never be caught. They also knew that speaking up would destroy not just their own lives, but their families' lives, their reputations, everything they had. And for Amber, the calculation was similar but even more painful. She hadn't killed Ryan. She'd tried to stop it. But she'd been there, and she'd said nothing. For years, she lived with the guilt, the knowledge that her silence meant Ryan's family suffered without answers. When she finally decided to speak, it wasn't because the guilt had suddenly appeared. It had been there all along. It was because she'd reached a point where living with it was worse than facing the consequences of telling the truth. Detective Torres, in an interview after the convictions, said he believed there were probably other people in Palatka who'd heard rumors, who'd suspected something, who'd maybe even been told pieces of the truth over the years but had chosen not to say anything. He said that's the hardest part of cases like this, not just the crime itself, but the way communities can protect secrets without even realizing they're doing it. The case also raised questions about the initial investigation. Some people criticized the police for not pressing harder on Justin and Tyler in 2008, for accepting their alibis too easily, for not noticing the inconsistencies. Detective Enzer, now retired, defended the work she'd done. She said she'd suspected Justin from the beginning but hadn't had enough evidence to charge him. She said she'd done everything she could with the resources and information she had at the time. And maybe that's true. Maybe the case was unsolvable in 2008 without someone breaking the silence. Maybe it required time, guilt, and the collapse of the bonds that held the secret together. What's undeniable is that Ryan's case might never have been solved if Amber hadn't made that call. If she'd kept quiet, if Justin had held on a little longer, if Tyler had never been confronted, the truth might have stayed buried. And that's a sobering reminder of how fragile justice can be, how much it depends on people choosing to do the right thing, even when it's hard, even when it's costly. Ryan Hillegas was 15 years old when he died. He liked baseball. He took care of his younger sister. He was trying to figure out who he was and what kind of life he wanted, the way all teenagers do. He didn't get to finish that. He didn't get to graduate, or fall in love, or make mistakes and learn from them, or become whoever he might have been. His mother still lives in Palatka. She says she thinks about Ryan every day. She says the hardest part isn't the anger, it's the absence, the empty space where her son should be. She's grateful that the people responsible are in prison, but she says it doesn't feel like enough. Nothing ever could. On the 11th anniversary of Ryan's death, in March 2019, just weeks before the arrests, Ryan's mother planted a tree near the spot where his body was found. It's a small oak, the kind that grows slowly but lasts for generations. She says she wanted something living to mark the place, something that would be there long after everyone who remembered Ryan was gone. And if you believe that people like Justin Soto and Tyler Marsh should be held accountable for what they've done, hit the subscribe button. Trolls won't. But people who understand that justice matters, even when it's late, even when it's incomplete, those are the people who keep stories like this alive. And that matters more than you might think. The tree is still there. It's grown taller over the years. People in Palatka walk past it, most of them without knowing what it represents. But Ryan's mother knows. And now you know too. What this case reveals, more than anything, is how much power silence has. Silence protected Justin and Tyler for over a decade. Silence let them build lives, make plans, pretend the past didn't exist. But silence also trapped them. It shaped every decision they made, every relationship they had, every moment when they had to lie or avoid or pretend. By the time Amber came forward, the weight of that silence had become unbearable for all of them. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Secrets like this don't just hide the truth. They consume the people holding them. They turn teenagers into criminals, not just in the moment of the crime, but in every moment afterward when they choose to stay quiet. Justice, when it finally arrived, didn't just hold them accountable for what they did to Ryan. It held them accountable for the years they spent pretending they hadn't. There's something else worth considering. If Justin or Tyler or Amber had spoken up in the days or weeks after Ryan's death, their lives would have been different, unimaginably difficult, but different. They might have faced consequences as minors. They might have been able to claim they were scared, that it happened fast, that they didn't know what to do. But they chose silence. And every year that passed made that silence harder to break, until it felt permanent. By 2019, when Amber finally called the police, she wasn't just confessing to being present at a crime. She was confessing to 11 years of active cover-up, 11 years of letting Ryan's family suffer, 11 years of choosing her own comfort over the truth. That's what made her decision to come forward so significant. It wasn't just about revealing what happened. It was about accepting the cost of having hidden it for so long. The community's response to the arrests was complicated. Some people were angry that it had taken so long. Others were angry that people they knew, people they'd trusted, had been capable of something so brutal. There was also a strange kind of grief, not for Justin or Tyler, but for the loss of innocence, the realization that evil didn't always come from outside. Sometimes it was already there, sitting next to you in class, living down the street, walking past you in the grocery store. Parents in Palatka started asking harder questions about what their own kids knew, what they might have heard over the years. Teachers wondered if there had been signs they'd missed. The case forced the town to confront uncomfortable truths about loyalty, peer pressure, and the ways young people can convince themselves that staying silent is the same as being innocent. It's also worth noting what didn't solve this case. It wasn't DNA. It wasn't forensic breakthroughs. It wasn't advanced technology or investigative techniques that didn't exist in 2008. What solved this case was a human being deciding that carrying the secret was worse than revealing it. That's a kind of justice that doesn't show up in crime dramas or courtroom movies. It's quiet, uncomfortable, and entirely dependent on someone finding the courage or desperation to finally speak. Detective Torres said in one interview that he wished every cold case could be solved the way Ryan's was, with someone coming forward voluntarily. But he also acknowledged how rare that is, how much has to go wrong in a person's life before they're willing to sacrifice themselves for the truth. He said most people will carry their secrets to the grave if they can, and that's why so many cases stay cold forever. Ryan's mother has said that she doesn't think about Justin or Tyler much anymore. She doesn't visit them in prison. She doesn't read their letters, if they've sent any. She says her focus now is on making sure Ryan is remembered, not for how he died, but for who he was. She started a scholarship fund in his name for students at Palatka High School who demonstrate kindness and integrity. It's a small thing, but it's something. She also says she's thought a lot about Amber over the years. She doesn't forgive her, she's been clear about that, but she understands that without Amber, there would be no answers. She says she's grateful for the call Amber made, even if it came years too late. She says sometimes justice isn't about punishment or redemption. Sometimes it's just about the truth finally being told. The journalist, Marcus Webb, who wrote the article that helped bring renewed attention to the case, said he never expected it to lead to an arrest. He thought the article might generate some tips, maybe push the police to take another look, but he didn't think anyone would actually confess. He said the power of storytelling, of forcing a community to remember something it had tried to forget, is often underestimated. Sometimes all it takes is putting the truth back in front of people, and something shifts. One of the questions people often ask about cases like this is whether forgiveness is possible. Can Ryan's family ever forgive the people who killed him and then hid it for over a decade? Can the community forgive Justin and Tyler for betraying their trust? Can Justin and Tyler forgive themselves? There's no easy answer to that. Forgiveness is deeply personal, and in cases involving murder, especially the murder of a child, it's not something anyone should expect or demand. Ryan's mother has said she's not interested in forgiving anyone. She's interested in remembering her son and making sure his death wasn't meaningless. If that means holding on to her anger, then that's her right. For Justin and Amber, the question of self-forgiveness is probably even harder. They have to live with what they did, not just the crime, but the years of silence that followed. They have to live with the knowledge that they could have spoken up at any time and chose not to. That's a burden that doesn't go away, even with a guilty plea or a reduced sentence. Tyler, who has never expressed remorse, faces a different kind of future. He'll spend at least 25 years in prison, possibly the rest of his life. He'll grow old knowing he killed someone over $20, and that he tried to escape accountability for over a decade. That's the life he built for himself through his choices, and there's no undoing it. What happened in Palatka in 2008 wasn't just a murder. It was a test of a community's ability to confront hard truths, and for 11 years, the community failed that test. People went about their lives. They ignored the rumors. They didn't push too hard. They let Ryan become a footnote, a sad story that eventually faded. But when the truth finally came out, when the arrests were made and the confessions were public, Palatka had to reckon with what it had allowed. It had allowed 3 teenagers to kill one of their own and walk free. It had allowed a mother to grieve without answers. It had allowed silence to be stronger than justice. And maybe that reckoning was necessary. Maybe the only way forward was to acknowledge how badly the town had failed Ryan, and to commit to doing better. There's a broader point here about how we think about cold cases. We tend to assume that unsolved cases stay unsolved because of a lack of evidence, or because the suspect is too clever, or because the police didn't do their jobs. But a lot of cold cases stay cold because people choose not to talk. They make a decision, conscious or unconscious, that protecting themselves or their friends or their community is more important than telling the truth. And as long as that's the case, as long as silence is rewarded and truth-telling is punished, cases like Ryan's will keep happening. Families will keep grieving without answers. Killers will keep living free. And communities will keep carrying secrets that eat away at them from the inside. What makes Ryan's case different is that the silence eventually broke. It took 11 years, but it broke. Amber made the call. Justin confessed. The truth came out. And while that doesn't undo the harm, while it doesn't bring Ryan back, it does prove that silence isn't permanent. It can be broken. It just requires someone willing to pay the price. That's what makes Amber's role in this so complicated. She's not a hero. She was part of the cover-up. She let Ryan's family suffer for over a decade. But she's also the reason the case was solved. She's the reason Justin and Tyler are in prison. She's the reason Ryan's mother finally got answers. And that duality, the fact that someone can be both complicit and courageous, both guilty and necessary, is hard for people to accept. But that's the reality of cases like this. Justice isn't clean. It doesn't come from people who've done everything right. Sometimes it comes from people who've done terrible things and finally decide they can't live with it anymore. Detective Torres, who worked the case after it was reopened, said he learned a lot from the investigation. He said he learned to trust his instincts, to follow up on details that seem insignificant, and to never assume that silence means innocence. He said he also learned that people are capable of carrying unimaginable secrets, and that the passage of time doesn't make those secrets any less dangerous. He said one of the most striking things about interviewing Amber and Justin was how normal they seemed. They weren't monsters. They weren't sociopaths. They were just people who'd made terrible decisions and then spent years trying to live with them. He said it reminded him that evil isn't always obvious, and that the capacity to harm exists in ordinary people under the right circumstances. That's a hard truth, but it's an important one. If we only think of killers as fundamentally different from us, as irredeemably evil or broken, then we miss the ways that ordinary people can be pulled into terrible acts. We miss the role that peer pressure, fear, loyalty, and self-preservation play in sustaining violence and cover-ups. Justin and Tyler weren't born killers. They became killers in a moment of rage and stupidity, and then they became liars and manipulators to protect themselves. And the longer they got away with it, the easier it became to keep lying, until lying felt normal and telling the truth felt impossible. The broader community has tried to move on since the case was resolved. The tree Ryan's mother planted is still there, quietly growing. The railroad tracks where Ryan died are still a place where kids sometimes hang out, though maybe fewer than before. Palatka is still a small town with economic struggles and tight-knit families and a complicated relationship with its own history. But something has changed. People talk about the case differently now. They talk about the importance of speaking up, of not protecting people just because you know them, of trusting that the truth is more important than comfort. It's not a perfect transformation, no single case can fix a community's problems, but it's something. Ryan's mother says she hopes that's her son's legacy. Not just that justice was done, eventually, but that people learned something from his death. That they learned to ask harder questions, to push for the truth even when it's uncomfortable, to refuse to let silence win. She says she talks to Ryan sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet. She tells him about the scholarship fund, about the tree, about the ways she's tried to keep his memory alive. She tells him that she's sorry it took so long, but that she never stopped fighting for him. She tells him that he mattered, and that his life meant something, even though it was cut short. And maybe, in the end, that's what justice looks like. Not a perfect resolution, not everyone getting what they deserve, but a family finally being heard, a truth finally being told, and a community finally acknowledging what it tried to ignore. Ryan Hillegas deserved so much more than what he got. He deserved to grow up. He deserved to be safe. He deserved friends who wouldn't hurt him and a community that would protect him. He didn't get any of that. But 11 years after his death, he finally got his name back. He got his story told. He got the people responsible held accountable. It's not enough. It will never be enough. But it's more than a lot of victims ever get. And if you stayed to the end, you're someone who wants to understand what really happens when the truth is buried. That kind of curiosity is rare. It's the kind that doesn't look away just because the answers are painful. And if you haven't already, please subscribe, like, and share this with someone you know who values stories like this. I'll see you in the next one.